Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nabil Goher, for welcoming me. I am delighted. I would have wanted to speak for an hour, but I was told I have only 20 minutes. I'm delighted to be in this space, ladies and gentlemen, today. And I want to say good morning. Good afternoon, actually. Good afternoon. Let me say I'm happy to be here, and thank you for welcoming me. Your thoughtful invitation reflects a deep interest in forming a genuine understanding of the most important current issues in Kenya, which helps in formulating the best way of engaging with and around them. The reception accorded to my delegation and I has been nothing short of commendable and has got me thinking that maybe I should have been here earlier. I also appreciate the warm introduction and kind words of my friend and brother Nabil. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you very warm greetings from the President and the people of Kenya. And as Kenyans say, hamjambo. The matter of where we are today cannot be properly understood independently of the long journey that brought us here, the things we take for granted in Kenya, the aspirations which form our conscious and unconscious expectations should not be divorced from where and who we are a decade ago. On 4th August 2010, Kenya took decisions whose momentous ramifications continue to unravel even now. The product of that day's referendum was promulgated on 27th August, inaugurating a new governance paradigm. Yet, we did not get to 2010 in a flash. The fundamental issues that animated the desire for constitutional reform revolved around marginalization, an opaque and repressive and unaccountable executive, captive parliament, and a subservient judiciary. Under this undesirable system, citizens served the government instead of the other way around. It was felt that there was neither recourse nor escape except physical flight and exile. Indeed, a large component of our diaspora those days were political exiles. Further, we must never underestimate the social, economic, and political gravitational force exerted by an imperial presidency, which recruited members of parliament to the cabinet and controlled the parliamentary program, appointed judges, and controlled the judiciary, had absolute and unilateral discretionary power over public land, and was effectively in control of every sector. How did the 2010 Constitution change Kenya? First of all, it recreated the executive, delinked it from parliament, and thus ensuring that neither institution was functionally adulterated. A leaner executive of 24 replaced its customarily bloated predecessor, whose size normally ranged around 70. The new executive focused on delivery, with a cabinet dedicated to implementation. Today, appointees of the executive must be vetted by parliament, and an array of constitutional commissions, including the National Land Commission, independent offices now exist to accountably and transparently exercise what in the past were prerogative powers of the executive. The executive has no say in the calendar and operations of parliament or the judiciary. Its size is restricted and role no longer commingled and conflicted. The single most important instrument of policy making, the budget, has been demystified. There are no more secrets around the Treasury's ministerial briefcase, which in days past was the focal point of public obsession and mystery. There are no more gray areas. The people must participate, and Parliament must decide. Under the current Constitution, legislative efficiency of Parliament has been enhanced. As a result, Parliament runs an independent program and calendar. Days when the President decided when to dissolve or open Parliament are behind us. In turn, legislative output has improved with 294 bills passed in the last 7 years compared to 83 in a similar period in the past. This efficiency helped us in the constitutional implementation process. Along with the individual focused Bill of Rights, public participation, which did not exist at all in the previous constitutional regime, has been propelled into the center of public policy making and implementation at all levels, further elevating the office of the citizen in governance. The tone and often enough fundamental character of public discourse in Kenya has therefore changed irreversibly. This recalibration of government arms and institutions has produced efficiency, which has been manifested throughout all levels of governance. The Constitution therefore has dispersed power horizontally between arms of government and independent institutions and devolved it to 47 county governments. At the county level, resources are targeted at locally developed priorities. The best manifestation of devolution in practice lies in the domain of health services. The achievements made by devolved health services traverse many facets, as well as expansion that go far beyond what was imaginable before the new constitution. County governments inherited a total, for example, of 874 doctors. To date, 4,637 new doctors have been hired, while from 6,620 nurses inherited before devolution, new recruitment has increased the number to 25,595 in the first 5 years of devolution. Additionally, 52,969 community health workers have also been recruited. For the very first time since independence, a cesarean section birth was performed in Mandera in 2014, open heart surgery in Mombasa County in 2015, and a brain surgery in Embu last year. Before devolution, these services were only possible in Nairobi and at a great expense. The Judicial Service Commission has an independent budget and manages the appointment, promotion, and discipline of judges. As we worked on the implementation of the 2010 Constitution, President Kenyatta and I realized the political culture that revolved around personality cults, tribal parties, and ethnic contests needed to be done away with. In essence, the political software and architecture needed to be changed. Everyone agrees that 2007-2008 period brought Kenya to the precipice of an abyss. We resolved to apply lessons learned from that dark and tragic passage to shift the country's political trajectory and change the political culture. For many reasons, it was widely accepted that the communities popularly seen as protagonists could never be reconciled sufficiently to cooperate in any respect or at all. A family maintained faulty strategic assumption in Kenya's political practice was that the enmity between communities in the Rift Valley, for example, and central Kenya was eternal and that productive engagement between their leaders was utterly impossible. Under these conditions, Kenyan politics was organized around negative ethnicity, or what Professor John Londe has termed political tribalism. While cognizant of this lazy dogma, we decided to change this assumption and forge a new political paradigm that brought communities and leaders expected to be perpetually hostile and antagonistic to the sphere of conciliation, collaboration, and cohesion. The principal objective of this difficult and politically unpopular resolve was to change Kenya's politics with our eyes not so much on winning seats or gaining power, but on uniting people. Although it was not initially possible to have one political party for the purpose, we forged a coalition that from day one was managed as a single political party for all intents and purposes. Subsequently, we took the next politically difficult decision of formally merging 12 political parties into one party. What did I do? These changed the political landscape in the most fundamental way since our independence. For example, the debate in the last election, because of what we had done, became about the best policy courses to deliver free compulsory primary education and free secondary education, while we took credit for the rollout. Our competitors said they had thought about it. Countrywide transport infrastructure, including the standard gauge railway. While we built the first 600 kilometers in a record 3 years, our competitors said they had planned about it. And resolving the security situation in Somalia was a major campaign contest, while we insisted that it was necessary to keep our troops in Somalia until we eliminate all threats of terrorism. Our competitors canvassed that our troops in Somalia should be brought back home at the earliest opportunity possible. Another fundamental consequence arises from the persistent claim that no party or government had ever won elections on the basis of its development agenda or achievements. In turn, this claim gave birth to the advice that it was necessary to engage in spectacle, drama, sideshows, and emotional appeals, including personal and tribal appeals, to achieve political traction. President Kenyatta and I prosecuted our last election campaign in terms of what our government had achieved and on the basis of solid evidence that was to be done on what was to be done in the next 5 years. The outcome of that election affirmed our thesis and debunked long-held but spurious suppositions. Our party won more seats at every tier than all the other parties combined, and of course, we won the presidency fair and square. In pursuing a systematic program of de-ethnicizing politics and running a competent administration, we have managed to achieve huge transformation for Kenya. Even as we acknowledge the self-evident and direct, as well as more nuanced and indirect positive returns of our new constitution, we must also admit that many Kenyans have professed reason to be dissatisfied with certain aspects of the fundamental normative architecture. The reasons given or particulars set out include the much contested winner-take-all character of our electoral contest, as well as perceived functional paralysis occasioned by the disjuncture of the executive and parliament. We know that there is persistent friction and perceived overlap between the levels of governance over allocation of functions and resources between the two levels of government. There has also been a feeling that the counties do not possess sufficient capacity yet to perform certain functions. Although described in the Constitution in apparent clear terms, debate persists about overlaps, duplication, the shareable revenue vis-a-vis respective functions, the borrowing powers of counties, as well as counties being able to raise own revenues to outgrow current over-reliance on the national government. The question that we need to ask ourselves, are these misgivings well-founded and deserving of a remedial constitutional amendment? The fact that we have registered tremendous success under the current constitution does not mean that any misgivings around some aspects of its architecture are unjustified. In fact, some challenges currently being encountered are not wholly unexpected. Nearly 30% of Kenyans did in 2010 express these concerns in one way or another. At a personal level, I prosecuted a number of them with the expectation that the committee of experts would apply itself adequately. I bear witness to the fact that the issues with the Constitution do actually predate its promulgation. I and others strongly took issue with the way the structure of the executive vis-a-vis the opposition had been formulated. The current formulation undermines executive accountability and saddled our democracy with a headless, incoherent, and dysfunctional opposition. The Constitution neither recognizes nor creates the functions of the official opposition. It is not proper that the leader of a party garnering the second highest votes has no formal constitutional role. Elections in Kenya are close-run contests. Often enough, the winner and the runner-up achieve more than 5 million votes. The winner ascends to a formally constituted constitutional leadership role, while the runner-up becomes a virtual stranger in leadership. I have had some suggestions, even by opposition leaders, that the national executive should be expanded to include a prime minister as well as 2 deputies as a means of addressing the winner-take-all challenge. I don't know how that is supposed to be achieved, because this suggestion has 2 problems. It does not resolve the problem, which is that we need a functional, constitutional, official opposition. And secondly, even if the positions were created, it would still be taken by the winning party. So you're not solving the problem. My suggestions are as follows. First, the national government should be reconfigured to comprise the national executive headed by the president and the official opposition headed by the leader of the party or coalition of parties whose presidential candidate wins the second highest votes. That is good for accountability. And secondly, it removes or mitigates the winner-take-all perception. The leader of the party which becomes second becomes the leader of the opposition, and with his or her running mate automatically becomes members of parliament and assume the leadership of official opposition. This formula should apply at the county level as well. I further propose that with the leader of opposition taking leadership of the opposition in parliament, the deputy president should then take over the leadership of government business in parliament. This should be replicated at the county level by deputy governors. The Senate, we must make a decision to make the Senate the upper house. Because as currently formulated, the Senate is something in between many things. Thirdly, cabinet secretaries should be ex officio members of parliament and must attend sittings of parliament at least once a week and whenever required to answer questions on the floor of the House. This will remove the perception that there is a disconnect between the executive and the legislature. I, however, maintain that members of cabinet should not be elected members of parliament. Fourthly, we must resolve once and for all the mechanism for the attainment of the 2/3 gender rule. We must apply ourselves to it, we must deal with it, and we must overcome it. Having said this, I know I'm pressed for time, having said this, the next question is, do we have the constitutional moment to prosecute these reforms? Let me put this question in context. Constitutional implementation is still underway, and gradually we see gains building up. For example, in the first election in 2013, no woman was elected governor. Yet in 2017, 3 women, in Kitui, Bomet, and Kirinyaga, were elected as governors. In 2013, we had no female elected senator. This changed in 2017 when Uasin Gishu, Isiolo, and Nakuru County elected female senators. Moreover, no educational requirements being mandatory, the majority of members of county assemblies were persons with limited education in 2013. In 2017, engineers, doctors, teachers, and other highly educated professionals contested and are now serving as members of county assemblies. So progressively, capacity is being built around those institutions. The trend supports the expectation of progressive entrenchment of constitutional standards, values, and principles in every implementation cycle. Thus, have we reached the moment when we may say that we have sufficiently tested the full scope of the dispensation, or do we still need time? That is a decision that Kenyans will have to make. And let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, by saying that even as we worked on consolidating and implementing our new constitution, equally, we focused on regional integration. The same 5 years, we have made tremendous progress in consolidating the East African community. We now have a single tourist visa covering 3 countries. We can travel around East Africa with limited paperwork. Citizens in the East Africa can now travel using their identity cards. And in fact, the East African community is the most progressive trading bloc, with our intra-trade at around 20%. That is the highest, not in Africa, but in the global south. And as we consolidate the EAC, Kenya in 2015 signed into the tripartite agreement that brings together EAC, SADC, and COMESA, and brings together 26 countries, a population of about 625 million, and a GDP of about 1.3 trillion US dollars. Last year, again, His Excellency the President signed Kenya into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is moving at a very high record. We got 44 countries that signed in 1 year. We have already 18 countries that have ratified, including Kenya. In fact, we were the second country after Ethiopia. And within months, we expect another 4 countries to sign, or to ratify, sorry, which means that when we reach 22 countries, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will come into force. That is in a couple of months. Meaning that as we implemented our devolution program, we didn't lose focus of the need to build a strong regional partnership. It is our contestation that, or our position, that devolution consolidates a nation, harmonizes a nation, and creates a strong nation. And it's strong nations that will have the capacity to forge strong trading blocs regionally. And therefore, it is not a contradiction. It is not a paradox. It is a continuum from devolution to integration. Let me conclude by saying that in one community in the Rift Valley, there is a saying that says, "Kergei kipset agiptep." Do you understand, Mr. Chairman? In essence, it says something like this, that the person who works very hard, or the bold guy, or the courageous person, sometimes achieves as much as the coward or the lazy guy. How so? It was said in this community that when there used to be, in the old context, communities used to go to raid cows from other communities. So it was said that the brave guys would go to bring the cows from the next community. The coward and the lazy guy would remain at home because he's scared to go, because it was a dangerous adventure. But in the process, he would give birth to girls while he was hanging around. So when the others came back, they had to pay bride price. And this character who was at home would give out his girls, and he would end up with some cows. So the brave guys who went to bring cows will have some cows. The coward at home will also have some cows. That's how they... Why am I saying that? I'm saying that just to emphasize the point that there is no contradiction between devolution and regional integration. Thank you very much.
Stand.
Please do that.
Well, let me first begin by thanking Alex and the Chatham House fraternity for inviting me to come and talk to you here this afternoon. As he has pointed out, I'm coming from the US, where I attended the Democratic Party convention, which is ending today. And I had to actually reorganize my program and cut short my stay in the US. Therefore, I was not able to be there when Madam Hillary Clinton was delivering her acceptance speech, because I wanted to come and talk to you here this afternoon. So I chose the subject of the importance of democracy in Africa. This is my second time talking to you people here, maybe the audience it's changed a little bit. I was here in 2012 when I addressed an audience here. Now, let me begin by those who don't know me or are familiar with me, that by stating clearly from outset that I'm talking to you as a Pan-Africanist and an Afro-optimist, as opposed to Afro-pessimists. That Afro-pessimists are those who have given up on Africa, those who say Africa is a lost cause, that Africa can never, ever come out of poverty. But Afro-optimists are those who believe in the ability of the African people to develop Africa. Now, I want to talk about democracy in Africa, and I begin also by saying that I believe that democracy is a universal concept. I'm saying this because there's some people these days who want to say, oh, well, it is Africa, and therefore the standards need to be different. I say that I don't agree that we should have lower standards for Africa, that Africa is part and parcel of the human race, and therefore the bar should not be lowered when it comes to African democracy. I begin by saying that from the pessimisms of the past, when Africa was seen simply as a basket case, ruined by conceited and ruthless dictators, Africa has now become a puzzling case of rapid economic growth in the midst of promising political changes. Nonetheless, this new dawn may easily be jeopardized by the reluctance to embrace the far-reaching democratization at the political level and progressive reforms at the economic level. Both require committed political leaders with the long-term visions that were typical of our founding fathers like Kwame Nkrumah, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, and more recently, Nelson Mandela. Yet democracy is in jeopardy in Africa in the second decade of the 21st century. Many pro-democracy activists in Africa are no longer sure they have the support of the West. Many are not clear if it is still the policy of the West to stand only with regimes that promote open, free and fair elections, transparency, good governance and human rights, or we are in the era of anything goes. I'm saying that this is not the first time that we saw this kind of development. Soon after independence, some of you may, through reading, know, or those who were there, that a very typical development took place almost all over Africa. The founding fathers of the continent began to say that Africa was different from the rest of the world and talked about traditional African society which provided for resolution of conflict by way of consensus. Leopold Senghor argued very eloquently. He called it palaver, that people used to sit under a tree, then dialogue, and then an agreement was reached. Dialogue, as he called it, or palaver. Kwame Nkrumah equally argued eloquently, and they say that multi-party system was alien to traditional African society, that the African society allowed for conflict resolution through consensus I've mentioned, and therefore, through a series of measures, coercion, blackmail, bribery, the opposition was led into extinction. And that saw the emergence of single-party dictatorships, then moving on to military coups and military dictatorships, or one-man rule, the strongman syndrome, as that is why Monsieur le Président, the president. So there are indications that the West is turning its back on democracy by cutting funding, endorsing regimes with dubious records, and abandoning democracy, activists, and civil society. In those days of Cold War, this was the case. The West was more obsessed with the war against communism. So if you came up and said that you are an ally of the West in the war against communism, nobody cared how you were running your country. You could do whatever you liked, but you got all the money that you needed. That's how we created the African strongman. Idi Amin Dada could kill hundreds of thousands of Ugandans. And still he was elected as the chairman of the Organization of African Unity. Mobutu Sese Seko, Kungwaza Banga, also did the same thing in Congo, killing opposition members and so on. Kamuzu Banda of Malawi could go live on a BBC interview and say that his opponents, Chiume and Chipembere, if they dared set foot in Malawi, would be delicious meals for the crocodiles on River Zambezi. Jean Badel Bokassa of the Central African Empire, because he converted the country from a republic to an empire, crowned himself the emperor of Central African using millions of dollars of public funds that were published in the country. So what I was saying is that this had happened. It was only with the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the wind of change began to blow in Eastern Europe, that it started also blowing on the African continent, bringing down these dictators, the single-party military regimes, and reintroducing political pluralism on the continent of Africa. But when that wall came down, only 3 sub-Saharan African countries were classified as democracies: Botswana, the Gambia, and Mauritius. Elsewhere, presidents for life and single-party dictatorships held sway. A seismic change has since happened from that time. Out of 55 countries that make Africa today, over 25 are considered democracies of varying degrees. Africa had 22 competitive elections in the year 2012 alone. At least a dozen sub-Saharan African nations have held or are due to hold presidential or parliamentary elections this year. One of the shortest-lived military coups took place in Burkina Faso early this year. It was the country's 7th military coup in 50 years and was staged by presidential guards loyal to the deposed ex-president Blaise Compaoré. It lasted just 7 days. The Financial Times quoted one of the coup leaders saying, and I quote, "We realized the people were not in favor of that. That's why we quite simply gave up." As the Burkinabe repulsed the coup leaders, in Nigeria, voters elected Muhammadu Buhari as president, making him the first opposition candidate to defeat a sitting Nigerian president through the ballot. And the defeated incumbent, Goodluck Jonathan, conceded defeat. That had been almost unthinkable in Africa. The gender trap, too, is giving way in African politics. The US is having its first female presidential candidate in Mrs. Hillary Clinton. And I express my bias. I hope that she will win and become the first woman president in the US. The UK has its second female prime minister, in Madame Theresa May. Africa, on the other hand, has had 3 female heads of state this century. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia, Joyce Banda in Malawi, and Amina Gurib Fakin in Mauritius. Most countries in sub-Saharan Africa are currently witnessing lower economic growth rates than those seen over the past decade as a result of the continued adjustment to lower commodity prices and higher borrowing costs. However, for much of the past 20 years, some of the world's 10 fastest growing economies have been African. Even with the slowed growth, Africa is still growing faster than most developed economies. Secondary school enrollment in sub-Saharan Africa grew by 48% between 2000 and 2008, while malaria deaths declined by 30% in some countries and HIV infections dropped by up to 74%. Life expectancy has also surged by between 20 and 42% across Africa since the year 2000. Of the 37 countries to have seen life expectancy rise more than 10% since 2000, 30 are in sub-Saharan Africa. In Malawi, for example, life expectancy rose from 44.1 years in 2000 to 62.7 years in 2014, according to the World Bank records. In the past decade, real income per person increased by more than 30%. In the previous 20 years, it shrank by nearly 10%. The World Bank Economic Forum places Ivory Coast, or Côte d'Ivoire, as it is also known, as Africa's fastest growing economy, with expected GDP growth of 8.5%. It is followed by Tanzania at 7%, Senegal at 6.6%, Djibouti 6.5%, Rwanda 6.3%, Kenya 6%, Mozambique 6%, Central African Republic 5.7%, Sierra Leone 5.3%, and Uganda 5.3%. The message is clear. Countries that have adopted accountable and democratic governance systems have made strides on the social and economic front. These countries are reaping the democracy dividend that ensures sound management of public resources and political stability through regular, credible elections and peaceful and predictable transfers of power. These gains created a prolonged period of stability that allowed a new wave of investment. So far, so good throughout the picture. However, as I said at the start, these gains are threatened by the absence of sustained momentum for deepening democracy in Africa. I want to agree with the former UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan, who said, and I quote, "Democracy is not just about one day every 4 or 5 years when elections are held, but a system of government that respects the separation of powers, fundamental freedoms like the freedom of thought, religion, expression, association, and assembly, and the rule of law." Any regime that rides roughshod on these principles loses its democratic legitimacy, regardless of whether it initially won an election, unquote. The Washington Post, in a recent editorial, said, again I quote, "The tyrants of today are more sophisticated than those of the past. Rather than outright totalitarianism, they erect a facade of democracy and subvert it from within. They hold elections that are not competitive, use government-approved shell groups to edge out genuine civil society, pass laws outlawing free association and speech, and force the news media into submission by pulling the strings of the owners and editors. They brand as foreign agents any group receiving money from abroad. These trends are ongoing in Africa. And what has become the vogue is that elections are held as a ritual, they must be won by the incumbent at all costs. And the election of observers will come weeks before the elections, stay mostly in the capital cities. At the end of it, then give a verdict that though there may have been flaws here and there, by and large, it was the reflections of the will of the people. Regular multi-party elections have not translated into good governance and respect for the rule of law and fundamental freedoms. That's why there's new thinking that rather than focus on elections alone, there's need to focus on building freer societies, separation of powers, independence of the media and the judiciary, devolution of power and resources, restriction on presidential power, and respect for term limits. While the West has previously underwritten democracy, it appears to be pulling back. In the current issue of Foreign Affairs magazine, respected scholar Larry Diamond says, and I quote again, "One of the biggest challenges facing democracy today is that its biggest champion, the United States, has lost interest in promoting it." Unquote. I agree, and it is a sad development. When you see events taking place, like recently, we had elections in the Eastern African countries, which even some observers do not know how to describe. And you see what is happening in Burundi. And you see that the African heads of state meet, and their concern is not about what is happening in Burundi, but more how to pull out of ICC, because one or two heads of state of Africa are charged in ICC. Then you actually begin to understand the magnitude of the challenge that Africa is facing today. Africa's elections are being judged not by how free and fair they are, but how peaceful. The performance of incumbents is getting judged by how they can be used to fight terrorism, no matter the human rights abuses that accompany the fight and the economic gains that come with doing business with those regimes. First is, they are an ally in our fight against terrorism. So terrorism now becomes more important than democracy within the countries itself. And then, if we don't cooperate with them, China is going to edge us out. So let us forget about whatever this may be a bad guy here and there, but we need to have a piece of the cake. So look the other way around as far as abuse of human rights are concerned. My focus on elections and what happens between elections is informed by experiences in Kenya. One electoral cycle is enough to wipe out all the gains made over a prolonged period of time. In December of 2007, after 5 years of steady economic growth under the NAC government, Kenya was suddenly thrust into a political crisis following a botched elections. Botched elections, everybody knows what happened. From an 8% annual rate of growth, we dropped to a miserable 2% in 2008 after the post-election violence. That is why since 2013, Kenya's opposition has demanded fundamental reforms to the electoral infrastructure as the surest way to safeguard democracy. We are pursuing reforms in the system of voter registration, the counting of votes, results transmission, and announcement of the results. We are pushing an electoral body that operates in a truly open and transparent manner, with an obligation to complete the disclosure of all its operations in the conduct and management of elections. These efforts in Kenya and elsewhere in Africa need the backing of all forces that believe in democracy. They require that the US and the EU, and I don't know now the region out of EU, must do more for democracy, must fight corruption, defend internet freedom and the media freedom, and protect democracy activists. You remember during the elections in Uganda recently, they completely shut off the country. You could not penetrate, use the internet, supposedly for security reasons. It is our hope that the next president of the US, together with the EU and Britain, will support democracy in word and in deed. The West must show unequivocal support for civil society and the rule of law, accountability, human rights, and free and fair elections. The march of democracy is to be guaranteed. And I conclude once again by saying that so far gains have been made, but we are now witnessing a regression, and that is need to remain on course, which will continue to propel Africa on this growth path. Because right now we are seeing the rate of growth beginning to drop as commodity prices have gone down, and that the economies have not been diversified to be more competitive. And we are seeing the rise of corruption on the continent, which is diverting vital resources from public to private hands and pockets. And therefore, it is important that we continue on the path of reforms to ensure that this growth is sustained for the benefit of the African people now and the future generations. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honourable Raila Odinga. We now have 25 minutes for questions and clarifications and discussion. I have to say it was a pessimistic picture that you depicted of Western policy toward Africa in particular, moving away from values, particularly the value of democracy, to one of interests, particularly mercantilism, I think is what you're suggesting. But maybe we can discuss that. Who would like to ask a question? So I'm going right to the corner over there first. You've got a tall arm. And do tell us who you are.
I'm Andrew Weir of Africa Confidential. Sir, can you tell us what you are doing and what the prospects are regarding what most people seem to believe is an increase in tribalism in Kenyan electoral politics?
Thank you. We'll take 3 questions. So, gentleman right here, right in the front row.
Conor Gaffey from Newsweek. You've obviously just been at the Democratic Convention in America, and you said about the US having to support democracy in word and deed. Do you think that both the presidential candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, would be able to do that?
Thank you. Gentleman right here on the corner.
Thank you very much. Godson Azu from London Political Summit. I'd like to find out, sir, you sounded very optimistic about African democracy. Can you tell us what you think about this new idea coming out of Africa that is called Afrocracy? Afrocracy. I think it's a new ideology by some politicians in Africa trying to redefine African way of politics from the Western way of democracy. Is there anything you think that you understand about this whole thing, about this new wave of Afrocracy ideology in African politics?
Thank you very much. So, Raila, you have 3 questions there. Thank you for each of the questioners for being short and concise.
First, on the issue, the role of tribalism in Kenyan politics. This has got historical roots. It actually started from after independence, the way the country has been governed. During the struggle for independence in the country, people were very united as one people against the colonial system, the colonial rule, as it were. Because to the British colonialists, everybody was just a bloody African. Bloody African. So this, of course, made the people to come together to fight and remove the colonial masters. Unfortunately, the nationalist movement split immediately after independence. And when we say the role of the elite in politics, because it is the elite which use ethnicity or ethnic discrimination in competition for resources in the country. And you find that the leadership will surround itself with an elite from their community and say, oh, we are the ones who are in power, and these people want to take power from us. So it becomes us versus them. And that is the genesis of tribalism in Kenya. The British had tried to use it slightly toward the end in what you call divide and rule, but it became more enhanced after the independence. You contrast Kenyan development with that of Tanzania. When you had the Mwalimu Nyerere, a Pan-Africanist, who created higher values to which people could aspire and promoted what was called Tanzanianism, or Tanzania, as he called it, or Tanzania, so that people were united as one people and there was no ethnic discrimination in Tanzania. So I'm telling you about the historical background of ethnicity in Kenya. It is still a factor in our society today. It is still being used by descendants of those who introduced it in our country's politics. Therefore, it's not a factor that you cannot ignore. But ethnicity in itself is a major impediment not only to integration and unity of a country, but also to its development. Whereas people with talent are discriminated upon merely because they come from this community and this other community, and mediocrity is promoted. Basically, disillusionment begins to reign. People become disillusioned. That is itself what is responsible for immigration, particularly of the African intellectuals, out to greener pastures, because they cannot get equal treatment in their own societies. It is something that we must stop in our country. And that is the reason why we are addressing it. We are addressing it with a view to eliminating its role in our society. U.S. role post-elections. Of course, I've been to the U.S. now for the last 5 days, and I have witnessed the intensity of the campaign that's going on between Republicans and Democrats. I think that for the first time, I've been going to the U.S., these conventions. This was my 4th convention. I was in Chicago, I was in LA, I was in Boston. But I think the issues are very clear-cut this time around between the Republicans and Democrats. I don't know that if Republicans have a policy on Africa. If they have, I did not hear it. But I believe that there may be some positive changes if the Democrats win. I've had the opportunity to discuss with senior Democrat senators, like Senator Kuhn, Christopher Kuhn, who is been on Africa or on Foreign Relations Committee. And they clearly have a vision for Africa, which in my view could help Africa deal with some of these negative developments that we are talking about, if they were to implement it. Afrocracy, in my view, is something that is basically being invented by those who are hell-bent in fighting Pan-Africanism or trying to misuse Pan-Africanism. Those are the people who are trying to be more inward-looking, to say that you need to apply completely different standards for Africa. Therefore, you see that the leadership is forming a kind of a bond that will lower standards in Africa, trying to basically defend themselves. You've seen these efforts at limiting or removing the term limits. It's a trend right now where most of the leaders who were forced by the wave of that wind of change I talked about after the fall of Berlin Wall to agree to introduction term limits are now removing it under the guise that the people want them, that without them there can be no stability in the country. This is happening, and that's why you see that Burundi can be in that kind of state where people wake up in the morning with dead bodies on the streets. But you see that most surrounding countries in the Eastern Africa region cannot come out strongly and face Burundi. The AU cannot send troops to poor Burundi, basically because they have this problem that I may find myself in a similar situation tomorrow. So they are unable to act. You have this situation where Kabila is now trying to postpone the elections under certain disguise that some reforms need to be done. Now in Sierra Leone, they're trying to do the same thing. That there was Ebola, and therefore 2 years were lost. The president should be added another 2 years. So on and so forth. Then even Japan, they could have asked for extension of the time for elections because there was a tsunami. I basically come down to what I'm saying, that there should be no different standards for Africa.
Just stay there, Raila, because I'll get a more cluster of people. And let's start in the far corner there first, and then we'll come along.
Hello, Honorable Dinga. My name is Nancy. I'm a Kenyan citizen. My question is, do you think there is a democracy in Kenya, yes or no?
Thank you. That's exactly the sort of questions we want to hear. Please.